Yes, thank you. Well, Adrian and I together, sometimes known as Kadrian, are both co-leads for the Mindfulness Initiative with the responsibility for education. So we're both jointly working on this theme um, as a parallel really to the workplace work, and really felt that there was such an obvious overlap. And as we'll be telling you, what we're talking about is very much starting with teachers and in the workplace. So this felt like a good thing to do. In terms of my background, I was a teacher originally, so I've had that first-hand experience. And I've worked in universities since then, as finally either rising or dropping to the level of professor, whichever way you see it. In the process of which I was a senior manager, I was a head of department and a dean. So I've had a fair experience of workplace type issues, human resources and so on, as well as the academic side. So I'm bringing that, I think, to this conversation. My specialty before I got into mindfulness was well-being and mental health and so on. And I've always taken the view that if you're looking at education, you look at the total setting. So it's not at all just about classrooms or kids. It's always for me been about a whole school approach, and always starting with teachers. And I got into mindfulness myself through an experience of ill health, and just found it so transformative that I've incorporated that into what I now do. So I have this sort of two hats really, of well-being and mindfulness, and I do all the usual academic stuff of research and publishing and talking at people, hopefully with people. And I teach mindfulness at my local academy to the teachers there, which is great because it's really got me grounded in what it's like to be in the front line. So that's kind of who I am.
Thank you, Katherine. Adrian, would you like to say a few words?
Thanks, Andrew. Good evening, everyone. So I'm Adrian Bethune, as Katherine said, the other co-lead. And yeah, I wear a few different hats at the moment. So I've been a teacher. I retrained to be a teacher in 2010, a primary school teacher. I still teach part-time at a school, in a junior school in Aylesbury. I'm a lead trainer with the Mindfulness in Schools project, although I haven't done, so they moved all of their training online. I haven't done any online training, so I'm looking forward to getting back to face-to-face training, hopefully at some point in the future. And I also chair the MISP support and inclusion group for BAME educators and mindfulness teachers. And what else do I do? I've written a couple of books focused on wellbeing, so wellbeing in the primary classroom. And I co-wrote a book with Dr. Emma Kerr, a secondary teacher, called A Little Guide to Teacher Wellbeing and Self-Care. And I'm also, about a year ago, was commissioned by Oxford University Press to write a wellbeing curriculum for their international schools. So the Oxford International Curriculum now has a dedicated wellbeing strand, and also wellbeing kind of being woven in traditional subjects like English, computing, maths, science. And the reason mental health and wellbeing is really important to me is because before I retrained to be a teacher and I worked in music publishing, I went through a period of poor mental health. I went through a period of acute anxiety that led to a bout of depression. And as someone that by their nature is quite a happy-go-lucky, optimistic person, that period in my life really threw me, and I literally had no idea how to help myself get better or feel better. And as part of kind of getting better, I stumbled upon mindfulness. And at the time I didn't start to practice it, but I just was aware that it existed. And when I retrained to be a teacher and started to experience poor mental health again in my first year of teaching, I did my first ever mindfulness course, and it was quite transformative for me. And ever since then, I've been convinced it should be a core part of education for teachers and for children.
Thank you. So just before we started the webinar, we discussed how people who introduce themselves tend to be, slightly self-deprecating, and I think it's fair to say that that's been true to form. So just to fill out a little bit about what I can share, Katherine has advised the UK government, European Union, World Health Organization, has co-written a book with the Zen master, and forgive me, I will pronounce that incorrectly, so perhaps you can correct me on that, but has written a book with the Zen master, which has been translated into 7 languages, and is currently leading the development of the vibrant community for contemplative education for mind and life in Europe. And Adrian has shared a stage with the Dalai Lama and has written several books. And he's also the lead author and designer of the Oxford University International Curriculum for Wellbeing. So, and I think I saw recently on Amazon that your book is currently a bestseller. So I think it's fairly safe to say that we're in good hands, people. I think these people know what they're talking about. So thank you again for your humility, as well as sharing your work and your time with us today. So question one, just in terms of a bit of context, really, it'd be great if you could describe your perspective on the landscape of mindfulness in education as a workplace. So not just, obviously your experience is broader than the UK. You may wish to focus on the UK if that's where a lot of your experience has been, but even better if internationally, yeah, what is your perspective on the landscape? Adrian, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I thought what I'd talk about first is broadly the kind of education sector as a workplace, and then maybe Katherine can fill in about how mindfulness relates to that. So as I said, I've been a teacher for just over a decade, and having worked in the private sector and then moving into education, it was quite a shock, the kind of what I kind of discovered. So a system of hyper accountability. So the first school I worked in, we were expecting Ofsted any minute. It took 3 years for them to finally come, but that hanging over our heads, just that there was an immense pressure on the head teacher, and that definitely fed down to us as teachers, and we inevitably passed that on to our children as well. But in that system of hyper accountability, and so being accountable to people like Ofsted, but also to parents, and everyone has an opinion on education, there is a distinct lack of autonomy in the teaching profession as well. And organisations like the NFER have written reports on this, that teachers in particular cite a lack of autonomy. They don't feel like they are fully in control of decision making in schools and the wider education sector. I also feel like there's a general lack of a clear sense of purpose in education in the UK. You know, are schools just for helping kids pass exams? Is it just about moving children on to the next stage of their education, or is it something bigger than that? You know, is it about developing the whole child? Is it about improving well-being? Is it about both good academic outcomes and well-being? Could that be a thing? Obviously, lack of funding. I'm painting quite a bleak picture here, but I think this is the reality, actually. This doesn't mean that every teacher is miserable, because I work in a school that what I would define as a happy school. Teachers feel respected. There's a lot of autonomy in our school. Teachers are part of the decision-making process, but that isn't the kind of trend nationally, which is why there is a recruitment and retention crisis, and has been for several years now. The government have not met their targets for getting enough teachers trained to actually teach. And teachers, according to reports by Education Support, they published for the last 2 years, the Teacher Wellbeing Index, teachers report significantly higher levels of poor mental health compared to the national average. It's one of the most stressful careers, according to the Health and Safety Executive in the UK. So that is the general picture. And as I said, it is quite bleak, and that there are pockets of really good practice and really good schools, but I don't think it's a very positive picture. And I do think things fundamentally need to change. And I see mindfulness as a core part of that change. But I'll hand over to Katherine now.
Yes, thanks, Adrian. And I think we're emphasising this because we've just written some guidance, by the way, that may not have been clear, you know, on mindfulness in schools, and starting very much with teachers, and starting with teacher stress, and looking at how mindfulness can not only help teachers cope with stress as best they can, but actually have the courage to transform things, you know. So we're careful not to victim blame, because we're aware of the critique of mindfulness, that it just makes people cope with the unacceptable. So I think if Adrian and I are sketching out a slightly bleak picture, it's to suggest that mindfulness needs to have a role within this picture, not just to be the elastoplast, but to actually help people to have the courage to change this and to ask really fundamental questions about what's the point of this, why are we doing it, you know, does it have to be like this, and so on. So, you know, that's, I think, the link. I think you just said something, Andrew, about internationally, so I'll just quickly sketch in. I mean, I'm not an expert on comparative education, but certainly looking at teacher well-being, it does vary in different countries. You know, in some of the Western European countries, it is pretty poor. In America, it's pretty poor. Interestingly, in Scandinavia, it isn't, because they have a very different attitude to teaching in Scandinavia, where teachers are far more respected, and all teachers are expected to get a master's degree in education, and then to be autonomous, to make their own decisions, to read the research, you know, to be critical thinkers. It's a really different. I was astonished when I went to Scandinavia, just how different, particularly in Finland, teachers are treated, and the way, the respect in which teachers are held, and it shows up in the statistics in terms of well-being and so on. So it doesn't have to be like this, is what we might say. And having been in teaching a really long time, I've seen it deteriorate. You know, when I started as a teacher, I had a lot of autonomy. And now I'm horrified by what teachers who are being churned out of teacher education, you know, the extent to which they're supposed to just read scripts and follow procedures and tick boxes. It's shifted hugely in my lifetime. So I think it doesn't have to be like this. And mindfulness, I think, is an important part of that. Sorry, Andrew, it's a rather long answer to your question. I mean, we could say in a moment where we think that mindfulness comes in. Would that be helpful at this point?
It would. I mean, there's so much in what you both shared already, and I'm just from, you know, as a complete non-expert, it's definitely my sense, having been a pupil and having been a parent with kids in school, that transformation from my recollection of what teaching was in the 1970s and 80s to what it is now is dramatically different. And my sense was that it was something different before then, you know, that it's been, you know, that autonomy has been lost. So that's fascinating, if not a happy story. And also I really appreciated you talking about mindfulness facilitating courage, and calling out that point around mindfulness not being a mechanism to enable people to fall over later harder. You know, it's anything but that. In my experience, as we bring mindfulness to people, they have a tendency to be actually more aware of what's going on and what is and isn't acceptable. Has been my experience of that. Sorry, Adrian.
No, just something that's interesting just sprang to mind when, before Katherine and I wrote this implementation guidance, we did a big consultation of the field of mindfulness and education, and we interviewed the great and the good from the world of education, mindfulness and well-being, and further afield. And I won't mention her name, but there was someone quite senior that worked at a multi-academy trust, and she teaches. So she works the kind of admin. She's not a teacher, but works in kind of senior management, but she's mindfulness trained, and she teaches mindfulness to some of her colleagues and staff. And in the interview with Katherine and I, she said that a surprisingly high number of teachers that she teaches mindfulness to decide to then leave teaching. But I laugh, because I do think part of, as we all know, part of good mindfulness training is to kind of step back and see the bigger picture. And I think sometimes when you practice mindfulness and you realize you're working potentially in a toxic school or a toxic system, you think, actually, I don't have to do this. And as much as I would love to change the system, for some people, makes complete sense to just step out, you know, and do something more aligned with their values or whatever. And for me, that has kind of been the case for me. In going to work part-time, that was initially because my wife and I wanted to share childcare, but I've remained part-time because I don't want to get fully back into a system that does tax me emotionally and mentally. And I kind of feel like just having a toe or maybe a foot kept in the system, I can remain connected to teaching, because I still do enjoy teaching young people, but I have other plans to try and change things, but by not being fully invested in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Adrian. And that's really where I met Katherine and Adrian, as you described, in the Mindfulness Initiative, and your role as co-leads in education, and that sort of mission, if you like, of the Mindfulness Initiative to really try to transform and bring mindfulness into UK society and internationally, and how to support that. So with that in mind, and with your recent publication in mind, and just to be very clear, it's called Implementing Mindfulness in Schools, an Evidence-Based Guide. It was released about a month ago, is that right?
Yep.
To great acclaim, and with huge attendance and interest in the launch. Do you want to say a bit more about your intentions about that? And that might well lead, Katherine, into your thoughts around how mindfulness fits in terms of part of the solution to the problem, if you like.
Yeah. Do you want to kick off, Adrian?
Yeah, so I mentioned we did this big piece of consultation work, and from that consultation, we were asking people in the field, how could Katherine and I help move mindfulness and education forward? And so they came up with some suggested actions and priorities for us. And I'll just summarize some of them. Some were to give advice on how best to develop authentic and sustainable mindfulness practice within education. It was to collate and share the latest research, develop a compelling case for mindfulness within the future of education, and to provide advice and guidance on how to measure the impact of mindfulness in education settings. So we kind of took all that and thought, actually, we need to create, a guidance document, essentially. And the other thing that we then created a steering group of kind of experts to help us, to feed back on the stuff that we were producing. And they broadly said that anything that we create has to be trustworthy and authoritative. So a lot of people cited the Mindful Nation UK report from 2015 and said that was a really robust document. It's well respected. A lot of people referred to it, downloaded it, read it. And if we could create something similar for mindfulness and education, then that would be really useful. Had to be evidence-based. So not just cherry picking, but looking, authentically at what the evidence shows. Has to be user-friendly, because teachers and school leaders and policymakers are busy people. So although it's quite a lengthy document, there's really neat, short, succinct summaries that people can just dip into. And it has to be widely appealing. So it has to be usable for a busy primary school teacher, a head of department in the secondary school, policymaker in Westminster. So yeah, that was the intention, to create a document that kind of covered those things. And in terms of what it actually says, the key messages, Katherine, do you want to share some of them?
I won't try and tell everybody everything, but just to say, obviously, it's not just about teachers and the workplace. It is schools. So it is looking, as you might expect, at students, young people, what you do in classrooms, and so on. But the order in which we put things is important, because we really start with the teachers. So in our outcomes chapter, we start with the evidence on the impacts of mindfulness for teachers before we do students. And when we're talking about how do you implement this, we start with the foundations and starting with teachers and so on. So the order in which we put things in the document is not what I think most people would have been expecting. I think most teachers who open this, most policymakers will expect it to be all about students at the beginning, with teachers as a kind of appendix. And we've really shifted that round, I think, and very much taking a whole school approach, which is about teachers and starts with things like stress and the organisational problems. So the order in which we wrote it, I think, is important, and I think has been quite helpful. And I think we're trying to balance lots of different things. I say we're talking about how to help people cope with difficulties and stress, but also how to cope with life as it is, so they don't all just change profession and do hang in there, because if everybody leaves, we're not going to have any change agents. So we're trying to do that, to get that balance. I'm thinking of all the various messages. I mean, when we looked at outcomes, we were struck, I think, and one of my jobs as a professor is to endlessly review evidence. So it's all kind of in there, but some of it's very succinct and summary with lots of background and case studies if you want to read it. But looking at teachers and the workplace particularly, we were struck by the fact that it doesn't just help with mental health and well-being and stress and depression and anxiety, which it does with small to moderate effects, but it actually helps teachers with their core job, with seeing priorities in the classroom, with staying focused, staying on task, because, you know, teaching's like a snowstorm of 30 kids coming at you. So it helps teachers be more effective. And of course, that has a knock-on effect to helping them feel calmer and remember why they wanted to be teachers in the first place and not to be overwhelmed. So it's not it's not an either or. Do you tackle the underlying causes of stress, or do you cope with the stress? You know, if you can manage the snowstorm of your job, you've got more spare energy to do something about the underlying causes as well. And we were struck that that's what the evidence shows. It also shows that teachers find it helpful in their core job of relating more effectively to students. So teachers, even if they don't ever get round to teaching children formal meditation or whatever, the attitudes of having a mindful classroom in which the teacher is really present for young people, really listening, actually there, being empathic, picking up on the emotional tone as well as the cognitive. All of this is the underlying wash, really. And we've talked a lot about that, because the evidence is starting to emerge that that's what teachers appreciate about it. We tried to make it clear that mindfulness is absolutely not about emptying the mind or feeling instantly happy or magic bullet stuff. I'm very aware that a lot of teachers still don't get that very well. They do think that it's about shutting your eyes, following your breath. The mind empties, you feel better, and there you are, Bob's your uncle, and that's mindfulness. We're emphasizing it's not that. It's about an interestingly different relationship with all of your experience, including the difficult. And sometimes things can get worse before they get better. And if you don't know that before you start mindfulness, people give up very easily because they say, I can't do this. It's not for me. I was teaching a teacher the other day who 5 minutes after the first meditation said, I can't do it. I knew I wouldn't be able to do it. It's not for me. My mind's not clear. And off, slam off she went. This was sort of, the induction, because she got it in her head that this was what mindfulness was. And this is a common problem. Again, the evidence shows this, that teachers really still think that it's a magic bullet. And of course, teachers who think that will teach that to kids. And then kids will become disillusioned. And there's quite a lot of work about teenagers not much liking mindfulness in schools because they feel it's normative and it's telling them to be a certain way and is kind of bland and happiness. And so we really do need to get the right view of mindfulness established in schools. And that's quite a tricky one because of all the myths around mindfulness that people come to the training with, really. I could say more, but Adrian, do you want to say something about the foundations or?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that's on your last point. That's why we started the whole document with what is mindfulness, and there's a section on dispelling myths, just to straight from the past. This is what we're talking about when we refer to mindfulness. This is not what we're talking about. And yeah, that was, again, the steering group said that that's really important because organizations like MISP and others come up against this time and time again, this misconception of what mindfulness is. And some of the other thing was some of the foundations of mindfulness in schools is, as Katherine said, start with the teachers. It also really helps to have champions, people that are passionate about it. So in my London school, when I first ever did my mindfulness course, I was one of those evangelical people because it had such a big, profound impact. And then I remember going to a Mindfulness in Schools project conference, and there was a really strong message about don't try and sort of trying to convert people to mindfulness, just practice and just, if it benefits you, great. And then, but it does help to have champions, people that practice it, people that can be enthusiastic about it, because that enthusiasm is infectious. You need sufficient resources. Often in schools, that is money, as in, can you pay for staff to go on training? Do you need books? Do you need whatever it is to help you teach mindfulness or practice yourself? The resources is also time. Is the school willing to put this on the timetable, which might mean something else has to come off? And an engaged senior leadership team. If you can have really enthusiastic champion, but if the senior leadership team are not buying into this, if they don't believe in it, it's unlikely to go anywhere, partly because they won't allow you time on the curriculum, they won't give you money and resources to go on training, etc., etc. So it's really great if someone on the SLT or a few members on the senior leadership team actively participate in practice as well. Yeah.
Just to add one small thing, Adrian, one of the things we're fighting a lot, or fighting may be the wrong word, but we're trying to stand up to, is actually the impulse coming from government particularly to make mindfulness easy, cheap, bung it out there. You know, programs, you know, you can buy programs on Amazon, you can buy them anywhere, you know, there's quite a lot of programs that go straight for the kids and straight for the idea that it's about calm. And teachers are buying this stuff and thinking that's what it's about. And so we, you know, what the theory that Adrian and I are outlining here is one that really needs stating quite firmly, because that's so much of the drift. You know, tick the box. We do mindfulness in our school. We teach kids, you know, to shut their eyes for 2 minutes and do 7-11 breathing, job done. You know, it's trying to get across that it's a deep attitudinal thing. You start with teachers, that it turns into an ethos, and it's about the school's values, and it can transform what you mean by education. That's the model that we're talking about. But it's, you know, mindfulness light is what we're struggling with a lot of the time.
Well, I mean, everything that you've just shared resonates with a number of other sectors, and that won't surprise you at all. You know, in my experience in the civil service, having those leadership champions was absolutely critical. I often joke that as a director, people were unlikely to laugh in my face. They might be doing it behind my back, but they wouldn't be doing it to my face. And similarly, having the director general supporting me was even more important, because it meant that I had that senior backing. So that point about senior leadership. And just to your point, Katherine, the very recently I had somebody who was sharing that their organization at a point of real crisis had issued a very well-known mindfulness app to everyone and made it available. And he was so upset, because it was kind of like, this is your response. And he never used it. He never looked at it. He was just cross, because it felt like such a dismissive, yeah, we can see you're all stressed, here's an app. And it was heartbreaking for him, really. So I empathize with all of that. One last question then before I think we should open it up. I don't think we're going to have time for the breakout sessions, because this is such a rich conversation. So I suggest if you could share your questions with Teresa, then we'll get to some questions after this. But one more question I really wanted to ask was, where would you like mindfulness in education as a workplace to go next? So what were your conclusions, and where next? Yeah,
do you want to do that, Adrian?
Yeah, I'll start. I think for my experience of practicing mindfulness and kind of being in a system that I was questioning, but was just too busy to answer those questions. When I started to practice mindfulness, my first few years of teaching, I really did step back and just start to push back on stuff and question, why are we doing this? Do we actually have to do it? And when I read this book, Mindfulness: Finding Peace in a Frantic World, there was a study done, University of Rochester in New York. Research discovered that more mindful people engage in more autonomous activities. That is, they do not do things because others want them to or pressure them into doing them. Those who are more mindful spend more time doing things they truly value, or that they simply find fun or interesting to do. And my hope is that, you know, the more teachers have access to good quality mindfulness training, the more acts of quiet and maybe not so quiet rebellion we'll start to see. I think because of this hyper accountability and this general lack of autonomy, and some of that lack of autonomy is about perception, I actually think we've got more control than we think we do as teachers. I would hope that, you know, more teachers and more school leaders and multi-academy trusts and would just start to push back on some of the things that we know are either causing harm or are just pointless. So that's my hope, and it links to the agency document that Jamie or the Mindfulness Initiative kind of released as well. It's about, that's what I hope for mindfulness in education, to increase the sense of autonomy and agency among teaching professionals, so that we do more of the things we want to do and we know are the right things to do, and less of the things that we know are just a complete waste of time or indeed are even harmful.
And linking that with just a few slightly bigger purposes, perhaps. I mean, we know that education is in some areas anyways, trying to get out of its traditional rut and to say, look, the world's in crisis. education needs to respond to this. We need different kinds of education. We need different sorts of capacities being taught. I mean, people like UNESCO and others are making that point, but they don't often see the link with mindfulness. And developing inner capacities. They often will go to technological solutions, lots of artificial intelligence or social media or apps or so on. And so it's really trying to make the case for why mindfulness should be there within educational transformation to meet the needs of the modern world, so that the kind of thing that Adrian's describing, where you say, well, what's the point of education at all? You can incorporate work on the inner person and developing our own capacities, things like, the attention, metacognition, self-management, self-regulation, these core things that Jamie talks about, become part of educational transformation, and to make sure we keep the human at the heart of education, and the messy emotional human, not just the human as computer kind of thing. So I think that's really quite an important one. So making the case for mindfulness, I think, within social change and within educational change is really very important. And to just also make sure that we do no harm. I mean, this, I think, again, is what Adrian and I are banging on about, that if we don't get this right, people can dismiss mindfulness, or it can be harmful. If we don't understand trauma, for example, with teachers and students, and we just have a one-size-fits-all, mindfulness is all about shutting your eyes and meditating and doing a body scan. Now that stuff is not indicated for everyone. So we need to be shifting, I think, from just the focus on formal meditation practice to much more about the ethos and the values, and linking with things like critical thinking and educational transformation, really making that case, getting out of our little rut, I think, and into a broader view of what we mean by mindfulness.
Fascinating. So I have many questions that I would like to ask you on the back of that, but I've already taken up far more time than I should have done with the questions that I've asked. So may I throw it open to our wonderful community and see if anybody would like to ask a question? If not, I will. So is there anybody with a burning question on the back of what we just heard?
Or comment would be good,
Yeah.
Yeah, take exception to what we've said would be good.
Gabriella first and then San.
Thanks, guys. Obviously for me, I'm coming at it from a different angle, but I just would really welcome any advice as to how you would advise for somebody like me as a driver trainer, who's hoping to, obviously I'm bringing in mindfulness to ADIs, driving instructors, so that it filters through to their pupils to improve road safety. And I would just love to find a way that I could find a way to work with an organisation such as MISP or any organisation to kind of join those dots, make that connection. And I just wondered if there's any advice you could give me with regards to how I might look to do that.
Yeah. So shall I say something about that? I think one of the problems that the organisations that that you might like MISP or others are really fully engaged in trying to just do something with their own programmes in schools. They're not funded. They're not funded to be a kind of public service in that sense. I think what you're talking about, San, really you need to go to the Mindfulness Initiative or to research areas, because
it's only because they teach road safety in schools, and it was just kind of that connection, really. Yeah. Well,
that would be a really interesting way forward. But I think you'll find that the people who run the programs don't have any spare capacity is the trouble. But they haven't got really good websites. I mean, the Mindfulness in Schools website is fantastically helpful in terms of bringing together the research base and the principles.
Yeah.
But
and that's it. And everyone who I've spoken to has been so helpful, and I appreciate the people that I've spoken to and the feedback I've had. But for me, it just makes so much sense to kind of make this connection with young people, coming from school into the driving lessons, to make that connection. And there is so much work that's being done with regards to road safety, and it just makes so much sense to me that mindfulness needs to be a part of this conversation, and that's it, really.
You might find linking through sport is helpful. You might find linking through the sports department is helpful.
That's a good idea. I hadn't thought that.
That's kind of where things like focus and attention and performance are the goals, and it might link very well with.
Yeah, that's a good point. It could be a good starting point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, San. Gabriella, I think you had a question. or a
Yes,
comment?
I'm not sure if my question is really appropriate. I mean, I could maybe somewhere in the website, I didn't really look around. It's just, what would be the program outline in education to provide mindfulness? So what's, because at the moment I'm training to become an MBSR teacher, and there is so many other ways within mindfulness. So is there like a program outline you already have for this?
Well, Adrian and I talk about programs that other people do. I mean, we have a table of programs we think are sound at the back of our guidance, but we're not ourselves writing yet another one. But you might find, I mean, Adrian, you probably want to talk about the Mindfulness in Schools program particularly, because they're...
Yeah, so the Mindfulness in Schools project have a kind of pathway. So their model is very much learn mindfulness, kind of practice it yourself, and then begin to teach it. And so, yeah, to get onto MISP training, whether that's for Pause B or the .B, which is their secondary program, and they've now just released DOTS, which is a kind of early years mindfulness program. You have to have completed a kind of 8-week MBSR course or equivalent and have been practicing for at least 6 months, or at least that's how I remember it anyway. And then you can apply to attend their training, and then you either complete their 3 or 5 day training. I'm not sure how many days it is now because it's gone online. And then you are kind of certified to teach mindfulness in a school setting. And they're really clear that it has to be in a school setting, because when I was completing their training in my head, I was thinking, oh, I could there's a local scout hut on my road. I could leaflet the road and I could teach mindfulness to kids in that scout hut. And they were like, that's very much not what you should do, because in a school setting, there's really robust, clear safeguarding procedures. So if a child disclosed something during a mindfulness lesson, for example, you know that there's a designated safeguarding lead that you could say, this happened in this session, and they know exactly what to do next. If that happened in the local scout hut or whatever, where do I go with that? So that's why they're very adamant that it has to be, their programs are taught in schools mainly only. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much. And I just have another question.
But just to say, can I just say, Gabrielle, other programs are available.
Yes.
Mindfulness in Schools is probably the most comprehensive and the best evidence, but there's some very good programs: Youth Mindfulness, Mind Up, The Present, Compassion in Schools, Mind with Heart. It depends really where you want to put your focus. If you're watching compassion, Mind with Heart or Compassion in Schools might be a good one.
There is a broad,
it's more tailored and more relationship based than Youth Mindfulness. So have a good read. If you can download the document for free, and there's a table at the back which sets out all the different pathways, and the document itself has got case studies from lots of different programs.
Yeah, thank you very much, Katherine.
Sorry, Gabriella, can I just bring in Bernadine, who's raised her hand, and then if we've got to come back. Thank you.
Thank you. My question, and it had to do with some of the things that you've raised. So I don't teach children, I teach adults. And so I teach English, and I teach computer basics and digital literacy and things like that. And a lot of my students have some sort of trauma. Either they've been hurt at work, or they're new immigrants and they've had some sort of traumatic experience. So my concern for me and my students' relationship is how much, and I'm going to use the word impose, how much can I impose on my students, even though I think it's a great idea. And one of the things that I do is when they're doing an assessment, we do some breathing exercises to de-stress and calm their mind. And I try to tell them that, the calmer they are, the easier it is to access the information that they've been studying. But so my concern is for the safety mechanisms that Adrian was talking about that are in the school systems that aren't necessarily in the adult programs. So I'm kind of like trying to ask if you have any thoughts on how to address that.
Yeah, shall I answer that, Adrian?
Yeah.
Because in the implementation chapter, we've got a lot in there, I think, on how do you deal with this issue. You know, we really do frontline on that one. And there's a lot of thought, a lot of practical advice. And I think one of the things that we make clear is that our own enthusiasm, that it worked for us, therefore it's got to be great for other people, is something to really guard against, because it is a formal mindfulness meditation practice is not for everyone, and it can trigger trauma. And so, and it's a whole new world of getting 30 kids to do this. You know, this has never been tried before, and there is evidence that it can do harm. So we sound a lot of bells of how to manage that. The starting point is to base it on a relationship. So we're quite nervous about people coming from outside schools, striding into classrooms where they don't know anybody, and you know, trying to do this as a formal practice. If you know the kids, then you're on a much safer wicket. It's to be thoroughly invitational, to absolutely make it clear that this is an invitation, not a requirement. To say to kids, they may find this difficult. If they do, to give them all kinds of safe anchors, to never ask them to insist that they close their eyes, talk about a soft gaze, to say, if you're finding it worrying, you might like to do something else, you might like to, you know, take your mind somewhere else, just stop, you know, and keep reminding them of that during any practice. And really to emphasize the kind of more everyday stuff about mindfulness. So, you know, mindful eating a piece of chocolate is a much safer way in. You wouldn't start with a 20-minute body scan with kids you don't know. It really is to take a great deal of care on that, and to keep your eyes open, and ideally to have two of you in the classroom. So somebody is keeping their eyes open for children who may be showing signs of distress, and to keep emphasizing that, to be available after the class, to listen to that, to young people, and to just take a lot of care. And there's a whole effort now in schools to be trauma informed. But just to remind us, it's not just mindfulness practice. Kids can be, as you said, Adrian, before, traumatized by having to take their clothes off PE. you know, trauma, we've got to take care as teachers to do all of the things that we're talking about. But we do really have a sacred duty here not to think that formal mindfulness practice is absolutely good for everybody, because it really is not, and it can be quite harmful. But if you take it slowly, base it on relationships, keep your eyes open, keep making it okay for kids to say, I'm not liking this. No, you know, then you're on a much safer wicket. But it's a really important question you've asked, Bernadine, and I think we're increasingly aware of how important that is.
Thank you. So Elizabeth, and then hopefully Georgie, if we have time, just conscious of time. So brevity is always welcome.
Okay, try to keep it short and sweet then, Andrew. Well, thanks a lot for the presentation, Katherine and Adrian. And I'm so glad that you mentioned about, you know, teachers not fully understanding what mindfulness was all about. That struck me from actually reading it, that I've got the book with me. But looking at it again, I'm seeing that, if I've understood this correctly, that there were only 10 teachers who were sampled, and that seems to be a very small sample from which to draw such a sweeping sort of conclusion. And the second question, if I may, Adrian, you talked about working in a very happy school, and you talked about an international curriculum. I was wondering whether that is an international school, as we understand it, an IB, International Baccalaureate School. Reason being that both my daughters went to international schools, and definitely mindfulness was part and parcel of sort of the sort of mainstream. It was mainstreamed throughout the subject. So, are you in an international school?
No. So I'm teaching in a kind of state primary school in Aylesbury. It's just the curriculum that I'm writing is for international schools.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So yeah.
So
I'd love.
School is just a regular school.
Yeah, it is, and just very brief. The reason I think it is a positive place to work is because the senior leadership team believe that the well-being of pupils and staff is paramount, and so you know, they make decisions based on, is this going to harm, is this going to help, and where possible, where they have to do stuff because it's statutory, we do the bare minimum, and otherwise we just focus on what we think is really important.
Okay.
Can I invite?
Just to address your point, Elizabeth, about the little study with 10 teachers was more indicative, but the document does cite other pieces of research that show that basically, if you have quality criteria for what makes a good mindfulness course, that the adherence of most of what happens in schools to that is poor. Actually, you know, that the model people are using is often confused, that they're not a lot of program fidelity. So there is generally, and the programs themselves report that, you know, the people who run the programs say they're quite worried. And I think the point we're making in our guidance is we need more research along these lines. We need really to do more digging as to what's actually happening in classrooms. You know,
Right. My last comment was on the BAME issue, but of course,
the BAME issue, yeah.
But perhaps Adrian and I can have a separate conversation about that. I don't want to take up too much time today. Okay.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you.
Georgie, I think we've got time for a super quick question.
Yeah, I haven't read the research yet. I've been a little bit stacked, but I teach in university. So I just wondered if this extends to that level. You know, for me, mindfulness in university, especially very intense courses like medicine, that's what I'm actually doing my research project in at the moment. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about higher education.
Well, we decided deliberately to just go steady. So the first one is mainly focused on schools, but the principles, I think, are the same. And Georgie, if you want to email me separately, because I've got a lot of stuff on, you know, on higher education as well. There's a whole raft of things. You know, the work I do with Mind and Life Europe is about higher education, but our particular guidance, I think the principles are the same, but the application is at this stage school based. We just decided that you can't do too much in one document, or people just, you know, it gets too vague, you know.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for your questions. I think Gabriella's now stepped away, but we will follow up with Gabriella to say, if you have any further questions, please send them through to Teresa. And then if we may, Katherine and Adrian will forward them on to you for reply by email. Conscious that this hour, as they tend to, has gone remarkably quickly. Perhaps we could show our appreciation for Katherine and Adrian in the traditional way. Thank you very much for coming along. Brilliant. Thank you for all your time and your insights. It's been a fascinating session. And as I say, if there are any questions that we didn't get to, I do apologize, but please send them through to Teresa and we'll make sure they get through. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, everyone.